Hello, my name is Luke Gagne, a senior solution engineer at UiPath. The focus of today's conversation is going to be using agentic automation to improve the administration of our health savings accounts. Before I get into the demonstration, I want to talk about the history of the UiPath platform. The way I like to explain the history is in three main phases. Think of the first phase as the foundation or the bedrock of the UiPath platform. This foundation has three main legs. The first is going to be the development environment in which we create the automations. The second is going to be the robots that execute the automations that we develop. And then the third and final component is going to be the orchestration. So when the robots run, what credentials they use, what machines they run on. These three core components act as the building blocks for our subsequent two phases of the platform. In the first phase, we think about emulating human action, so keystrokes, mouse clicks, the taking of information from one system and posting it in another. In the second phase, we're going to try to expand that spectrum just past those keystrokes and those mouse clicks. And we're actually going to look at the more unstructured sources of information that us as humans read when performing a process. The main two sources of this information is going to be in the documents we read and also the communications we use with our colleagues and our customers. How do we get information from those unstructured sources and structure it to hand it back over to our automations to go and execute as part of this workflow? The third phase in the platform is using the emerging technology of generative artificial intelligence to further augment the use cases that we can automate within the enterprise. This is taking our scope from task-based activities of the keystrokes and the mouse clicks to looking at end-to-end processes and how we can revolutionize it using agentic automation. I'm going to illustrate this agentic automation in the platform today by following a HSA claim example in the workplace benefit space. Before I get to the HSA specific example, I want to talk about how we can differentiate between robots and agents. Robots on the right-hand side are deterministic. We define and codify the if-then-else logic that we want the automations to take as part of a long-running workflow. That paradigm shifts when we talk about agentic automation. Agentic automation is going to leverage generative artificial intelligence to make more non-deterministic decisions part of our existing workflows. Examples of non-deterministic actions can be semantic matching. If we have information from one format and we need to convert it to another, how can we do that without defining or codifying logic? The second would be natural language processing. How can we take human text, whether it's an email, a document, or some other interface, and reason and deduce meaning from that unstructured text? The third capability is the concept of reasoning. When we are underwriting insurance policy, how do we determine the risk profile? How do we look at the different pieces of information and determine what policy we're willing to underwrite for an individual? I'm going to try to illustrate the difference between robots and agents further with this HSA eligibility claim example. Before I get into the tool itself, I want to talk high level about the process I'm going to illustrate in the demonstration. To begin the process, we are going to have one of our customers reaching out to us. In this case, the customer is inquiring about the eligibility of an over-the-counter pain medication and whether or not it's covered under the existing HSA plan. This may sound simplistic in nature, but the more complicated example I always provide my customers is something like an acne pad. An acne pad is not going to be explicitly stated in your standard operating procedure whether or not it's included as part of an HSA plan. But the human claims specialist is able to deduce that an acne pad falls under a cosmetic expense, therefore is eligible under the HSA plan. That reasoning, that determination, that eligibility criteria is something we're going to try to hand over to our agent to take the first pass at. In order to do that, once the customer emails into the enterprise, we are going to have a robot to extract and index all the information from the email. This could be the body of the email itself, as well as any attachments that the customer is including. In the example of an HSA, this would be your explanation of benefits. This would be the receipts from the CVS, the Walmarts, or the Amazon. Regardless of the intake method, the robots are going to intake and structure that data and hand it over to an agent. Traditionally, with automation, the robots could accomplish this first step, but it would require a human to still review every single claim or eligibility inquiry coming into the business. What I want to articulate with the live demonstration is how we can use an eligibility determination agent to make some of that decision making and reasoning for us. I'll get more into the specific data points we need to provide an agent to accomplish that, but at a high level, the agent's going to be reviewing the information from the customer's submission on the left-hand side and interpreting that and comparing it to a standard operating procedure to determine if an expense is in fact coverable under the customer's HSA plan. A really important part of any artificial intelligence or machine learning technology is how do we govern and scale this across the enterprise. At UiPath, we think the fundamental method for providing that scalability or that controlled agency is having a human in the loop of the process. In our case, for my demonstration, I'm going to escalate every single inquiry that comes into the company. In practice, we're able to reason whether or not we need a human to review every single transaction, or if we're okay with some straight-through processing. As if any other normal automation, once the robot indexes information, hands it over to the agent makes the decision, and the human verifies the decision, we're going to hand it back to a traditional automation to actually go and execute and reply back to the customer. I want to spend some time talking about the configuration of the agent. There's 4 main configuration points in the agent. The first is going to be the prompt, or the set of instructions that we provide the agent to accomplish its task. In our example, the agent is going to be an HSA claims expert. Its sole purpose in life is to determine if an expense is eligible under the customer's HSA plan. In order to perform this task, we need to provide some additional information. And the way I like to position it is, if you were to have a new junior employee join, what pieces of information would you provide them in order to determine if an expense is eligible under an HSA plan? The first is going to be the memory or the context in which these decisions are made. In the context of an enterprise and an HSA claim process, this could be your standard operating procedures, your knowledge-based articles that actually outline what expenses are eligible under a given individual's plan. Very much like the human user, we're going to provide our agent this same information and compare it back to the prompt or the goal we define for the agent. The next component, I would argue, is the most important. Those are the tools we provide the agent to execute based on its set of instructions. These tools could be API-based connections to other enterprise applications you have, or it can be automations that we have through the user interface that we have existing automations configured for. The third and final component is going to be the escalation patterns. So if that new hire did not know how to handle a particular expense, how would they go and escalate to their manager or another individual on the team? The agents are going to have the same concept. We're going to be able to intelligently build in an escalation process to provide that controlled agency so these artificial intelligence technologies are not executing within a vacuum. To relate it back to the health claims example, I have information coming in from the customer. That robot is going to index that initial piece of information. In this case, John Doe is inquiring about an HSA plan and what is eligible or not. Based off that email, we are going to send that index information to the agent itself. The agent's going to look at its set of instructions that it defines. It's going to leverage that large language model we have configured to create a plan and perform the task of determining if an expense is eligible under the existing HSA plan, and then create the steps to execute based off of that request. In our case, this could be receiving information from the attachments, analyzing the client query, reviewing and comparing it against the standard operating procedure, and then actually drafting an email to respond back to the customer with. For the live demonstration, I went ahead and I modeled the HSA inquiry workflow that I was showing on the presentation. At a high level, this process is going to include three main actors. Those actors are going to be the automations that index and extract information from the documents and from the emails. It's going to be the agent that determines whether or not the expense is eligible. And then it's going to be the human that's in the middle of the agent and the automations to review the agent decision and verify that the agent is correct, determining the eligibility of a particular expense. In my case, I'm going to go piece by piece here and talk about these different components in this workflow, starting with the ability to index and process emails and then extract information from the documents themselves. This is all in preparation of that eligibility determination agent that I have configured. I have over 10,000 emails coming into the UiPath platform. These emails are tagged with intents or reasons why customers are reaching out to us about a health savings account plan. In addition to the labeled information, I'm also able to extract customer sentiment and quality of service from those communication channels. As part of the telemetry, I can drill into the individual tags and focus on the customer queries related to the health savings accounts. In my example, I have several emails coming into the UiPath platform that I have labeled being related to those health and well-being inquiries. I want to focus on John Doe's inquiry. John Doe is including information about his plan, such as plan number, his employer name, and I'm able to not only identify the intent of the email, but also extract the corresponding data points from that email. These pieces of information are handed back to the agent to determine the eligibility of the expense. This is where I want to drill into the agent itself before I go and run this long-running workflow as part of the process. I want to talk about how I'm able to configure the agent to make the eligibility determination based off of John Doe's claim. As I was outlining before, there's going to be four main configuration points for the agent. The first is going to be the prompt or the set of instructions I define in the agent building experience. In this case, I'm adding high-level instructions of what I want the agent to accomplish once it receives the request from John Doe. And then from there, I instruct the agent how I want to interact with its tools and its context. Drilling into the tools and the context, I'm able to see that I have three main points of configuration. The first is going to be the robotic process automation that extracts information from the receipt that John attached. The second is the ability to send an email directly to John Doe or draft it before I send to the customer. And then the third is using an API-based connection with Salesforce to go in and update John Doe's contact information in the CRM. These tools are configurable. We have out-of-the-box connectors for API-based connections with our enterprise applications. We also have access to our full orchestrator process library. So any existing automations we have in production, we can pull those into the agent. And we also can narrow scope agents and string several agents together to accomplish a long-running workflow. The next configuration component is the context that I provide the agent as part of its process. In my example, I have a HSA standard operating procedure document that I want the agent to review and compare the inquiries against when determining if an expense is eligible. Here's just an example of the HSA claim guidelines I provided. The next configuration point is the escalations in the agent memory component of the solution. In my example, I'm going to escalate all requests to human users and see the validation experience for the user to process this request. I'm going to show the agent running in two scenarios. The first scenario is in this test environment. I have that sample email from John Doe, and I'm simply adding that as an artifact to my agent before it goes and executes. When I provide that input to the agent, it reviews the standard operating procedure and formulates a plan in real time. In our case, my first step is going to be escalating to a human before it goes and emails a customer or updates the CRM. Before I show that escalation task, I want to talk about the auditability and traceability of these agents. In the first step of the process, the agent is reviewing that standard operating procedure and it's providing contextual information of why it's coming to its conclusion. In this example, you can see the page number, the confidence, and the overall conclusion the agent's making based off that standard operating procedure. Just one quick note when we talk about what we want agents to do versus what we want humans to do. This level of auditability or traceability is not available when we have humans in the process. Whereas when we're using an agent, we have full insight into why the agents are coming to the conclusion it's coming to. To go back to the overall workflow, I am going to go and view this escalation task I have configured. Here you'll see the HSA Claims Handler app. In that, you'll see a couple key pieces of information. One is you'll see the original customer email, and then you'll see the agent question it's posing back to the human user to verify. In this experience, the human user is able to review the agent question, compare it to the standard operating procedure, and then go ahead and submit a response saying if the expense is eligible or not. Once I go ahead and I submit this response, it will hand it back over to the robotic process automation or the agent to finish its execution. And this is where in real time, you'll see the agent drafting an email in order for me to send to John Doe, outlining if the expense is eligible or not. And then the second will be in the Salesforce system itself, what call notes are added as part of John Doe's inquiry. Here is the sample email that I drafted as part of that agentic workflow. And here you can see the inquiry by John Doe and the updated call notes based off that agent's decision. Once the agent is finished executing, you'll see the same level of traceability for each individual tool call, as well as the end result of the agent and what it's sending back as a drafted email. To bring it back to the overarching process, this agent is just one component in this long-running workflow. In our example, I talked about the ability to index and process emails and extract information from documents and how we're able to hand that formatted information over to the agent. Very similar to how I was showing the agent run individually, I can actually have this run as part of a long-running process and have all these components automatically connected and exchanging information, so we don't necessarily have to look at each individual component. We have a more process level view. In our case, I'll go ahead and I'll just run it from this process level, and you'll be able to see how that execution is different than me just running it on the individual agent level. In this case, I'm taking information from the emails and from the documents, handing it over to the agent to perform its analysis. Very similar to how we saw when the agent was running, I have a full audit or traceability of these components as they run as part of this long-running workflow. In this example, I'm drilling into the standard operating procedure analysis the agent completed. Similar to what I was showing in the agent building experience, we're able to see the confidence score, the content it's extracting from that document as part of its decision. And once I go ahead and as a human user validates that expense eligibility, a robot is able to send the email response back to John Doe outlining whether or not the expense is eligible or not. In my example, I'm just showing how one particular run of this process is able to execute. But the benefit of using the UiPath orchestration engine is I can look at this process holistically and understand where all the time in the process is going. In my example, If I go to this claims process, I look holistically across all the different runs of this particular process, we can see how long the agent is spending in each phase and other outlier information with this process. This helps our teams identify where those bottlenecks are and potential automation opportunities reside. To round out for a summary, we talked about HSA claims. We had a customer inquire about the expense eligibility for their given plan. We had automations or robots indexing and processing the emails and the documents corresponding to that inquiry. We took that information from the automations, structured it, and handed it over to an agent to determine whether or not that expense listed in the email was eligible or not under their plan. And then in the purpose of demonstration, I showed a human reviewing every single request coming into that health savings account's mailbox and determining whether or not the agent was correct in its initial analysis. And these, of course, all tie back to this long-running workflow. We're able to hand it back to an automation to go and execute on the narrow scope of the agent and provide continuous monitoring for our enterprise-grade automations, are really what makes UiPath a world-class solution when it comes to agentic automation.